Hello, everyone. My name is Jason, and I'm the director of the Strategic Threat Advisory Group at CrowdStrike. Today, we're going to talk about North Korea's rapid ascent to becoming a global cyber superpower. So like I said, I lead something at CrowdStrike called the Strategic Threat Advisory Group. And basically what our team does is we help our customers operationalize their threat intelligence capabilities. Prior to CrowdStrike, I used to work for a Big Four consulting firm where I built threat intelligence programs for Fortune 500 companies and government agencies. Prior to that, I was in the Army for approximately 7 years, where I held assignments at places like the NSA and United States Cyber Command. And now over to my colleague, Josh Burgess.
Hey everybody, so Josh Burgess. I lead the technical side of the Chief Threat Advisory team. Sounds like an arbitrary long title, but I'm the person who helps people action intelligence from a technical perspective, integrate, automate it, and build it into your workflow. I've been at CrowdStrike about 3 years running this program. Prior to that, working as a lead technical officer at a major credit card processor. I was there at about 4 years. Prior to that, U.S. intelligence community, doing that for about 10 years. And prior to that, military. What I've learned along the years is it's not necessarily about how much money you spend. Sure, you can dump millions and millions and millions of dollars in an InfoSec program or millions of dollars into an intelligence program, but it really won't make you better in the end. The idea is to learn from history, learn from the attacks and the techniques that we've seen, build that into your intelligence program, and help you get to the point where you're predictive instead of reactive.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. So here's the agenda that we're going to be reviewing today. We're going to start off with an executive summary that reviews overall the patterns that we've observed from North Korea. And then we're going to talk about their evolution throughout their cyber journey across a 3-phase process. Phase 1 is where they focused on military-focused targeting. Phase 2 is much more so about currency generation operations. And Phase 3, more about dual-focused operations. Finally, we'll conclude by giving a few predictions about where we think North Korea might evolve to in the future. So let's go ahead and start off with the executive summary. And probably the best way for us to characterize North Korea's path to becoming a global cyber superpower is across these 3 phases of their evolutionary process. In the first phase, we're looking at the Kim Jong-il dynasty kind of regime during that time frame. And during that time frame, they were very much so focused on power projection, really going after military targets. Also during that time frame, they were demonstrating the beginnings of their nuclear program. And so again, in this phase, they're really focused on kind of really projecting power and really pushing back some of their regional adversaries to include the United States, South Korea, and Japan. In the next phase, we're going to talk about currency generation operations. And this basically came as a result of a lot of the sanctions that were put on North Korea as a result of their nuclear program. So in order to bypass some of the financial hardships caused by these sanctions, we observed North Korea engage in a variety of different types of currency generation operations to include fraudulent attacks, ransomware, attacks against the SWIFT banking systems, and more. And then lastly, we're going to talk about dual focused operations, which is where we see them as currently being. And this is basically where they have a dual focused priority. The first one being really still going after these economic targets and still some of the currency generation targets, but also really expanding their global targeting apparatus to go after more international organizations such as the UN and other similar type organizations. So before we dive into talking about the phased approach that we saw North Korea leverage, let's do a brief history and review. So with the first few kind of attacks that we're observing here, what you'll notice is that for these 4 that I'm showing here, it's really much more so about lashing out. And in large part, I would argue that a lot of the attacks that they did early on their days were fairly ineffective. They engaged in a lot of different DDoS attacks. They attempt to use wipers on several different occasions. However, they weren't able to really do any serious damage in the beginning of their military targeting phase. And then as they kind of progress throughout this phase, what you'll notice is that the attacks become much more targeted as well as more focused. So here's what I mean by that. Whereas in the first phase, you see a lot of DDoS attacks and a lot of lashing out. In this subsequent phase, you see a lot more focus. For example, the exfiltration of 200 gigabytes of data from the South Korean Ministry of Defense, which, again, that's a major victory for the North Korean cyber capability. You also see them hold at risk the Korea hydro and nuclear power plant. You see them continue to go after critical infrastructure by going after the Seoul subway system, and then, of course, culminating in November 2014 with a very significant attack against Sony Pictures. In the next phase of operations, we see North Korea focus much more on currency generation, and that's what these blue little snippets here really mean, right? And this is where they're focused much more on engaging in attacks that allow them to generate currency, such as ATM cash out schemes, fraudulent attacks, the use of the WannaCry capability as a sort of ransomware, as well as stealing approximately $60 million from Taiwan Far Eastern International Bank. And then the last phase of their operations, what you see them now do is really engage in sort of this dual focused type of activity, where they're not only focused on still the currency generation operations, as indicated over here, where I'm circling my mouse with the stealing of $7 million from the cryptocurrency Dragon X cryptocurrency exchange, but also attacks against critical infrastructure, such as the one I'm illustrating here in October 2017, as well as attacks against international targets, such as the one that we're illustrating over here in August 2020. So again, we're looking at sort of this evolutionary phased approach where they start off with military focused targeting, then evolve towards currency generation operations, and then lastly, lead them to where they're at now, where they sort of dual focus in their operational stature. So now let's talk about the individual phases. And we're going to start off with phase one, which is military focused targeting. And again, from a military focused targeting perspective, here are some of the big areas that we saw them focus on. The first one being around the use of personas. So Josh is going to describe this in his slide, but basically what we saw North Korea do early on is use various personas in order to avoid blame or avoid taking too much credit for some of these malicious attacks. Like I said in the overview slide, we saw them engage in a lot of different operations against both South Korea as well as the United States, particularly ineffective operations, especially in the early days. And then lastly, I would characterize this phase as being really much so about power, very much so about power projection. So the ability to project power, to push back regional adversaries, to demonstrate to the world that they are this, extremely powerful regime with all sorts of capabilities. And this is very common for different types of countries who are trying to engage in deterrence in order to basically get the international community to kind of go more their way. So now over to Josh, where he'll talk about some of the personas and some of the more nuanced aspects of this phase of the North Korean operations.
Thanks, Jason. So a couple of different phases. Like when you look at the initial campaigns, all the way from 2009, 2011, Independence Day, 10 Days of Rain, really no misdirection. They didn't point to, hey, we're this group or that group or a fake hacktivist group. They just smashed stuff and they tagged it, but they didn't tag it as North Korea. Dark Soul was the first time that they actually misdirected. The Eagle Eyes of Who Is team, there's some references to Roman foot soldiers that they messed up, and I'll show you what that looks like in a second. Then Operation High Anonymous, because you know what, Anonymous is still big in 2013. Let's go ahead and ride that train if we still can. And they utilize that as their fake persona. Guardians of Peace, the Sony hack. Now, Guardians of Peace was interesting because, again, faked this persona, but they utilize a lot of the same artistry and same imagery from the previous campaigns like Dark Soul and High Anonymous. So I guess the artists there really weren't feeling too original with the latest campaign. The last one that we saw with some real big misdirection was Who Am I? And that Who Am I campaign was launched against the Korean hydronuclear program, or nuclear plant, excuse me. And they bent what is a traditional definition of hacktivist. They didn't just go in and do something for ideology. They went in and did something for ideology, but they also had an e-crime slant and espionage slant. So it's a little interesting. And that's really where the personas kind of stopped after that. So let's talk about military targeting of South Korea. And this is really where it first all kicked off. 4 July 2009, Dozer. Dozer is a multi-pronged malware approach. The first thing Dozer does is DDoS attacks. And the first one is leveraged at was US targets on the 4th of July. Then, we saw on the 7th of July 7th and 9th of July going against Korean targets. These targets going after gov, mil.com, banking sites, DDoS, fairly effective, not particularly great. And then came the wiper component. On the 10th day, the wiper command goes in and smashes stuff. 10 Days of Rain, the next evolution, 2011. CoreDOS, create a botnet and be our wiper. Now, this one was a little more tailored, a little more customized. This is when they first started building obfuscation encrypted in their malware. The other thing they did was interesting. They looked for files very specific to South Korean systems, files like .hwp or Hangul word processor, or files like GUL or AZP or some of the other South Korean tools. Again, though, a lot of the mostly DDoS attacks with a little bit of wiper on the tail of it. Dark Soul, this is when they really started making web. The Hastidi and the Whois wipers used against ATM systems, servers, workstations, multiple big, huge South Korean banks were hit pretty hard. Tens of thousands of systems were wiped. This malware worked on Windows as well as Linux environments. It really wasn't specific to one platform or the other. The other thing that's interesting about this malware is, the references to Histidi and Principus. They kind of messed up those references. Those are basically forms of old Roman soldiers. They kind of mix and match the definitions, mix and match how they were used. Really didn't read their textbooks quite right. Operation High Anonymous. Again, why not ride the anonymous train? That's big back then. Core High malware used against mostly South Korean government as well as immediate targets. The thing that's interesting about this campaign is a lot of the malware that we saw, that we took apart, the malware specifically had the credentials hard-coded into it. So they knew what they were breaking into before they broke into it. Once they got into systems, wipers performed, change administrator passwords from whatever they already knew it was to high anon 2013 and cause impact. The last big one, Kaminsky. Kaminsky targeted Korean hydronuclear plant. And this malware did extensive recon ahead of the actual infection. The reason this is a big deal, it ties all three together. It goes, the e-crime side, when they broke in, they demanded millions of dollars in order to disable, in order to re-enable systems. They also demanded that you shall shut down 3 reactors as a part of our demands. Not sure where that demand came from, but they also had an espionage piece. So the Kaminsky malware was designed to steal information about nuclear power generation, because if you've looked at a map of North and South Korea, North Korea is really dark at night. South Korea, not so dark. So they're trying to, push their military targeting, but also kind of straddle all 3 lines along with their attacks. Last one, power projections, the Sony attack. Retribution for the Interview, the James Franco and Seth Rogen movie that basically made fun of the Kim Jong-un and later led to his assassination in the movie. They got in, and this was an all hands on deck. They utilized malware from multiple different subgroups to get in and really smash things around. One of the best tools was Bramble, and then Core High for SMB spreading. These tools were used like years and years and years prior to the attacks. So get in, spread around, utilize SMB ports to move loudly, then utilize tools like MacTruck, which was used in Swift targeting, Nest Egg, also in Swift targeting, and the ATM attacks. Get in, steal information. They stole employee information from every Sony Entertainment employee under the sun. They also stole all the future movies before they were even released, posted them all out. Again, it goes back to that projecting power. You shall not mess with us. We don't take kindly to your slights at our leader. And that's how they did those attacks. So the first movie I'm going to show you guys, first demonstration I'm going to show you guys is Dozer. Dozer was the original destructive piece of malware that we saw from North Korea. Let's go ahead and roll it.
So this is the first of 3 different malware samples we're going to demonstrate for you guys. This is the OG of the DPRK destructive malware. What we're going to walk through is My Doom. Now, Dozer was the first real campaign that they did, and the first real malware family. My Doom is the destructive side. The reason we're doing My Doom is because My Doom operates really well on Windows 7 and Windows XP, where Dozer really only works on Windows XP to do what we really wanted to do. So since Windows XP license keys are nearly impossible to get a hold of at this point, which is a funny story because my wife just threw away the last of my old Windows copies a couple weeks ago. But since we don't have a copy of Windows XP, we're going to run this on 7. It's going to work just fine. Now, as I detonate this, a couple things to think about. Again, this is the original stuff, not particularly quiet. ARP requests are going to go crazy with this thing trying to move all over the network as much as it can. The other thing that's interesting about this is despite the fact that it's the early campaigns, there is a couple anti-virtualization tricks and techniques that they use in there. This is an obfuscated version of VM, so it works just fine, but there's a little bit of obfuscation to do. The other thing they do is the mutex that the malware creates is AHN_V3 Pro. So kind of a nod to South Korean antivirus, when they launched the campaign. The other thing that's interesting about this is when they go through and they execute, a lot of temp files are dropped. Unpack DLL comes down, more temp files, allowed beacon out back to a GET request that's really obvious. The GET request is /China/DNS. The 200 marking is google.com !, which is interesting. But again, not particularly well written, but it does its job. So we're going to go and execute this, and you're going to see what it does. So we're going to give this an executable name. Go, run, quick comb through. All the files are now locked. We don't need to do any more. As you can see, can't do anything with it. It's a gzip file. The gzip file is encrypted. The only thing that remains is a beautiful picture of this nice man right here on my desktop. That's the only thing that lasted from the encryption process. So that was the first thing we're going to show you guys. There's a couple more coming your way.
Awesome. Good stuff, Josh. So in this next phase, we're going to talk about the transition from the military targeting phase much more towards a currency generation type targeting aperture. And really what we're looking at here, and the reason that this happened, is because as a consequence of a lot of North Korea's actions during the 2008 to 2014 timeframe, North Korea, the international community imposed a variety of different sanctions on North Korea. So the way we saw North Korea respond was by engaging in cyber operations that allowed them to generate currency. The first of those was targeting against the SWIFT banking systems, where they were able to basically engage in a global fraud against several different banks throughout the world. The next was an ATM jackpotting technique, where during some of the subsequent slides, Josh is actually going to describe how they used fast cash to engage in banking entities throughout Asia and Africa. And then lastly, we saw North Korea actually also engage in ransomware operations via WannaCry, where they use ransomware in order to fulfill some of their objectives, and again, to make money in order to fund the regime's illicit activities. And now over to Josh.
Thank you, Jason. So SWIFT targeting, where it all started. Actually, the first incident that we saw was the Bangladesh bank targeting. They actually made quite a bit of money, well into 9-figure kind of revenue from that. Now, the way this initial attack happened was you get into systems, and they had deep knowledge of these targets well ahead of time. So get in, modify the SWIFT, the SWIFT transactions, delete the records behind you, and then, some additional steps. And the additional steps, especially in the beginning, was super interesting because they actually had programs designed to steal information as it went from the system processing the transaction to the printer. They don't want anybody to have any record of these attacks. Later on, the Vietnam attack, which is the next one that we tracked, they modified the Foxit reader to obfuscate and change the message as it went out. It kind of shows you that deep knowledge. This wasn't like e-crime attack that was a spray and pray trying to hit whoever they could. They knew what they were targeting. Over the years, they made over $2 billion in these campaigns. The other piece that goes along with this, because this is North Korea, is the wipers. The wipers were part of a highly modular framework going back to the 2-pence malware framework that was deployed in the end to mess up forensic evidence or mess up, tracking of actually what happened. And hopefully they get to keep their money. Sometimes they did, and then sometimes they did. The next one I want to talk to you guys about is ATM jackpotting, Operation Fast Cash. Again, starts with 2-pence framework. Get a beachhead there, deploy modular framework. Once the modular framework was in, again, highly targeted, really capable stuff. This wasn't like a spray and pray attack. They actually targeted the AIX operating system, which is owned by IBM. Now, if they, a lot of these banks, if they had the current version of it, if they didn't use legacy software that was end of life by years, a lot of these attacks wouldn't have been a possibility. So they targeted vulnerabilities in these older operating systems. So when the malware got in, it first targeted the switch application servers, intercept the cash withdrawal, and delete the record of it in the tail end. They also built in, as they went through this, a very high level of social engineering. In one case, they went after a major Chilean bank. When they hit the Chilean bank, I guess they didn't get in the way they wanted to, or they wanted to get in a different way. They actually recruited an individual from a LinkedIn post, found an individual that worked there that was network administrator, sent him a fake job interview, actually held a job interview over Skype in Spanish. Job interview went really well. Hey, you got the job. Just download this executable to help you fill out the application. Executable is a backdoor. As a result of these attacks, and much of them like them, we've seen over 30 countries be involved in APM jackpotting. Again, you want to show like the amount of time and resources. In one case, we actually saw 10,000 fraudulent cash withdrawals. These cash withdrawals were spread across 20 different countries all over the world, all these different cash withdrawals all happened within 5 hours. High level sophistication, high level of capability. It's definitely shows that they're broke. They need to make money. They need to get their their finances up to where it needs to be. The last one. This is the dawn of the ransomware. WannaCry. WannaCry actually started back in February of 2017. February 2017, malware was pretty well written, had some obfuscation, had a little bit of misdirection in there. Anti-mouse wasn't particularly difficult. Then we saw 2 more in March, started introducing things like Tor as a backend, started building an encryption. Then we saw more in April. April, again, kind of the next evolution. We saw SMB spreaders be put in there. But in May, that's when it went nuclear. That's when we saw all the effects that happened from it. We still don't know the initial infection vector. We think the core DLL framework, because in some cases, some of the initial victims had deshed over on their network, so earlier targets. The reason that the May one was such a huge deal, obviously, is they incorporated an internal blue into their attacks. The SMB, vulnerability, thank you, shadow brokers, for releasing that to the world. And that, caused a huge impact. 200,000 systems were infected all over the world. Now, the interesting thing about that is 200,000 systems, that's a lot of systems, right? But they only demand about $300 to $500 in Bitcoin, depending on the flavor you got. 200,000 systems plus $300 should have made a lot more money than $139,000 in revenue, but it really did. So, that was a genesis of their ransomware campaigns. Now we'll go ahead and show you guys the next video. And what I'm going to show you is the February evolution of WannaCry and where it really came from.
So what we're going to show you now is the second piece of malware that we plan on demonstrating today. What we're going to go through is the original version of WannaCry, the WannaCry that was first discovered on February 9th, not the ransomware campaign that we all know and hate that happened on Friday, thank you, Kim Jong-un, on May 12th. So we're going to walk through the malware and see what it does. A lot of similarities with the other stuff. AES 128 encrypted, file structure and file extensions are pretty much the same. The biggest difference between the two is really kind of around the propagation method. The reason the propagation method's different because the earlier version was found on February 9th. The shadow broker, the release of the SMB vulnerability, the SMB worm that we all also hate, wasn't really the release until March, so kind of a little before then. So we're going to kind of walk through the malware and see what it does. The other thing I want to kind of highlight is what's interesting about this malware and commonality between the recent WannaCry is, in this case, along with the previous case, when you kind of take apart the malware and you look at when it was constructed or compiled, it's UTC +9. The reason this is interesting is because UTC +9 is South Korean time, not North Korean time. North Koreans in 2014 made their own time zone, how North Korean did them, their own time zone, UTC +8.5. So this sample doesn't fall along with the right time zone. The reason for that likely is they're rocking pirated software. Who would have thought they weren't paying their bills? So let's watch this thing execute. What it does, here it goes. Puts everything with WRY extension, encrypts the files, pops up with a pretty ransom note that all your files have been safely encrypted, and now your computer is unusable. All the data is largely encrypted and gone. So that is the second sample. Hang with us. In a few minutes, we're going to show you the third.
Great, thanks, Josh. And that takes us to our third and final phase, where we assess North Korea to currently be at, whereas we're kind of see them right now that's sort of in this dual focused type operational stature. And when we say dual focus, what we're really talking about here is sort of a combination of that traditional military focus, but also focused on economic operations as well, things to not only enhance their national economic priority areas, such as agriculture, power generation, and similar types of critical infrastructure, but also still continuing along the vein of currency generation operations. However, one of the things that we see with these new currency generation operations is now the targeting of non-traditional targets, such as several cryptocurrency exchanges, especially those located in the East Asia region, within South Korea as well as Japan. Like I said, we also saw a lot more focus during this phase on economic growth targeting. And one way to think of this is sort of like they took a page out of China's playbook. Whereas China engages in a lot of economic espionage in support of their own economy, we're now seeing North Korea do the same. And like I said, it appears to be focused on the sectors, and particularly the critical infrastructure sectors where they need a lot of help. So things like agriculture, things like power generation. You heard Josh say earlier that if you were to take a satellite image of both North Korea and South Korea at night, you would see all the lights on in South Korea, and then you would see barely anything in North Korea. So in response, now you see North Korea focused on espionage operations to try to basically empower that aspect of their economy. And then lastly, beyond the economic growth targeting operations, and then beyond the expanded criminal operations, now we're seeing them targeting government-related entities, but going much further beyond the traditional government entities. And when I say traditional, I mean kind of like the traditional adversaries. So like the United States, South Korea, Japan. And now we're seeing North Korea think a little bit bigger, right? So now they're going after international organizations such as the United Nations. Recently, we even saw them go after the Israeli Defense Industrial Base. And what that really indicates is an increased amount of confidence on the behalf of the North Korean regime. And at this point, they really do believe that, yes, they've succeeded in the past. They've been able to kind of get to the point to where they're at now. And now they're really taking it to the next level. So now for this final section, I'll pass back over to Josh to talk about some of the more specific use cases. Josh, you're muted.
Thanks. Yeah, always going to slip AD at some point. So economic growth targeting. One of the biggest areas we've seen them focus in on is energy production, but not just energy in the form of nuclear, oil and gas, coal, multiple different groups. So in 2017, we saw targeting in North America pretty heavily. A lot of different organizations got hit. One of the biggest one was in Houston, Texas. And it goes to oil and gas. Not everything is nuclear. Now, these campaigns, they all built in malware that was designed to steal stuff. It had destructive backends of it, but it was more designed to steal than anything else. Especially in the most recent, oil and gas campaign, it was designed to go through, pilfer the information out, throw the wiper on the end, and then make it seem like they could actually control power. Fortunately, in every case that we've seen from then until even the most recent 2019 attack, everything was designed to be more business focused, disable business, not ICS systems. 2018, we saw the US really stop getting targeted. Europe and Asia kind of took up in its place as a result. The biggest, most notable attack, though, is the 2019 targeting of a major Indian power plant. This Indian power plant supplies power for most of southern India, so a huge deal when it hit. The malware utilized that was DTrack. The reason this is interesting is because DTrack's been used multiple times in the past. DTrack ATM stole information from Indian ATM systems. DTrack, in the early 2010s, was utilized against Korean banks. Again, we're using the malware over and over again. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let's just keep, operating the same way we were. The other thing that's interesting about this attack is India is a major trading partner with North Korea. So I'm not really sure what they were thinking on this one. Kind of, something to watch to see what the effects kind of fall out from that. Last one, and Jason was mentioning this earlier, crypto targeting. These crypto targeting operations involve a high amount of social engineering. In some cases, targeting individuals via LinkedIn, recruiting them, fake job applications like we've seen before. But in some cases, they actually create legitimate, what looks like legitimate fund companies, JHT Trading, Silas Trade Pro. They actually created these organizations, created these fake companies with, shells and whole backstories in order to be more, appear more legitimate. The other thing that's interesting about what they've done is collaboration with known Russian e-crime groups like TrickBot and TA505. TrickBot, for those that don't know, is a malware as a service. You have to be a highly vetted criminal to get access to the malware, but it's still malware as a service. So TrickBot got the initial foothold network. Foothold was established, connect to different systems, get full access. Then that access was sold to Lazarus tool sets, which did later monetary scraping and data collection off it. The last one is a new evolution of the ransomware, VHD. VHD, we believe, was deployed via vulnerable VPN gateways. Once the VPN gateways were exploited, the Metanet malware moved around and gather that information. This MetaNet malware is highly versatile, highly modular. It works on Windows, works on Macs, works on Unix. There's multiple different operating systems. It shows that they're maturing their operations and they're confident in where they're going. The next slide I want to show you guys, though, and this one's super interesting, because this is Kaminsky, North Korean APT, going after Russia. Not just going after Russia writ large, but going after Russian aerospace and defense. I'm not sure what they're thinking, because most of their armament, most of their arms and their military equipment comes from Russia. So I'm not really sure what they're thinking on this one, but it's definitely something interesting to watch. So what happened? We saw, or there were phishing emails were observed targeting these aerospace and defense contractors. These phishing emails look a lot like what target U.S. and European defense industrial base, fake job application. Because COVID's a thing, why not use COVID as well? So utilize the fake job application, the COVID operations, then drop the malware, and then move around the system to try to pull for data. It also goes back to the reconnaissance effort. So we've seen them as they've matured. It's not just get in there, smash and grab, and kind of feel your way around. There's a lot of scanning that was observed from April to September against Russian systems, as well as US and EU systems, that correlates along with these attacks. So highly sophisticated, great social engineering around it. Not sure what they're thinking of going after Russia, but something worth watching. So the last piece we're going to show you guys is another version of ransomware from North Korea. Again, this isn't highly widespread like WannaCry. This is more targeted and more moving into the big game hunting operations.
So this is the third and final piece of destructive North Korean malware we're going to be showing you guys. This one's a little bit different. Unlike WannaCry, which is strictly revenue generating, this is more of a smokescreen. This is designed to lock systems down, and it's a wiper, not ransomware. It's designed to lock systems down and distract instant responders from what's really going on. In this case, stealing millions and millions and millions of dollars from the Taiwanese Far East Bank. So the malware is going to execute. It comes along as a package. I should say that first. It comes along as a package, and this comes along with the whole 2-pence framework. Hermes is just a piece of it. It's a destructive piece. I would demo the whole package, but 2-pence, not quite as cool to look at. So this malware is going to go through and do what all ransomware does. First thing it gets on, or almost all, first thing it gets on the system, it'll check for language artifacts. It's designed, it has code in there to look for Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian. However, it only really checks and stops the process if it finds Belarusian and Ukrainian, not Russian, which is a little interesting. Then it'll do all the normal things, VS admin, delete shadow copies, look for backups, comb through every drive letter, use the Windows Crypto API to come up with a key pair, crypt things over AES-256, and then do all the normal smash things that we all know and love at this point from ransomware. So nothing really new or novel or interesting about this ransomware. The biggest thing that makes this something to look at is, again, it's not really designed to garner a ransom. This is only designed to distract instant responders away from what's really happening on the system. So we'll watch it execute, give it a few seconds, and then everything becomes unusable, deletes itself, and 1, 2, 3, everything's gone. And then there's your pretty ransom note. You don't pay me money in Bitcoin, you're never getting your data back, blah, 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 blah. All the meanwhile, everything is encrypted, nothing works. So thanks, everybody. Hopefully you enjoyed.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Josh. And now we'll finish off with a conclusion where we're going to make a few possible assessments of the direction that North Korea might go in the future. So the first one that we have up all the way to the left is around the potential use of advanced ransomware operations. So as Josh and I demonstrated throughout this brief, we've seen North Korea use ransomware for a variety of different reasons in the past, whether it be for the currency generation elements of the ransomware or for the potential destructive elements of the ransomware attack. What we think North Korea could potentially consider in the future is the addition of 2 new ransomware techniques that we've observed over the last year and a half, 2 years or so. And those are 1, data extortion, and 2, ransomware as a service. With data extortion, basically what the threat actor does is, in addition to engaging in the ransomware attack, they are now stealing valuable personal data during the course of the attack. And then after locking down the systems, what they do in addition to sending the ransom note is they also extort the victim with additional information such as PII or intellectual property or other sensitive data. And they basically threaten the victim and say that if they don't pay up, they'll essentially release that data on a data leak site. So that is one possible option. Another possible option is we could potentially look at and see North Korea engage in business models such as ransomware as a service, where they can potentially outsource large portions of their ransom operations to third-party affiliates, thereby allowing them to increase the volume of their attacks and therefore also likely the amount of profit that they get from the attacks. The second prediction or assessment that we have is that they will likely continue to take a page out of China's playbook, and we can see them really investing in this area. So, we've said throughout this brief that obviously, North Korea's economy is struggling. It's struggling in a variety of different ways for a variety of different reasons, whether it be because of having, being ran by a dictatorship, or some of the conditions that have been imposed upon them because of the international sanctions. We do see a lot of struggling within North Korea. And one thing that we could potentially see the Kim Jong-un dynasty or regime do is go after, continuing to go after these economic targets. And we've seen North Korea issue 5-year plans very similar to what China does. And whenever China has issued these 5-year plans, what we have observed China do immediately after the plans is engage in espionage in support of those particular objectives. So it is very possible that we will likely or potentially observe North Korea do the same thing. And then our last prediction is around the notion of cyber brinksmanship. So brinksmanship is basically a term used in deterrence strategy, where two sides are going against each other, and they basically want to see who's going to kind of call chicken first, who's going to kind of chicken out first. And that's sort of basically what we see them doing. We see them bringing their regional and international adversaries all the way to the very edge, and then potentially using capabilities such as cyber or nuclear capabilities to achieve those deterrent effects. We do believe that they're likely to evolve more towards the cyber side of the house, as opposed to continuing to use the nuclear option as their sole deterrent capability. And one of the reasons that we think they're going to use cyber more is essentially it's just safer for them. The more they play around with using nuclear weapons as a deterrent capability, the more they kind of the higher the chances that one of their adversaries, like the United States, might engage in a preemptive attack. And obviously North Korea does not want that. If North Korea were to go engage in kinetic conflict with the United States, North Korea would lose. And not only would they lose, their regime would potentially also be replaced. And they want to avoid that at all costs. So given that logic, it is very likely that they will instead kind of go the cyber route, which still allows them to project power, still allows them to kind of take swipes at their adversaries, but does so in a much safer way for them that not only has a lower risk of kinetic retaliation, but also a lower risk of having the Kim dynasty being replaced. So that is all we have. Thank you for watching our Black Hat talk, and please enjoy the rest of the presentations at Black Hat. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.